All right, welcome back for the second lecture on the master budget. So hopefully you guys worked through the problem at the end of the first lecture. It was fairly easy, but I figured an easy intro one, and then went onto the slides online and made sure that you worked through the correct solution. At the end of this lecture, we're going to get into a pretty substantial set of homework problems, so you'll definitely need to work your way through those and then check your solutions. Like I said, this is the second of four lectures for today's session on chapter six. And today, or on this lecture, we're going to focus on the production budget and how to get to the value of finished goods inventory. So let's look back at our budget. What we just did in the last lecture was we looked at revenues. Now, with that created, a firm will move down and they'll start working on their production budget. So let's look at that. The production budget really just shows the planned production for this period. And it's going to incorporate things like sales that we did in the last part. How many sales you're going to make this year will influence how many units you need to produce, plus your ending inventory. So if we want to sell 1,000,000 goods and we want to have 100,000 goods on hand, well, we know we're going to have to create or produce more than the million we're going to sell. But then we're also going to have to incorporate the beginning inventory balance. So we have the total amount we need to produce this period, but we can produce a little bit less if we already had some units in our beginning inventory. So it'd be our sales plus our desired ending inventory is the total amount we're going to need minus any we have on hand. And that will get us to how many units we need to produce this year. All right, pretty straightforward formula, a pretty easy calculation. So now we've done our revenues. We've used that revenues number to get to how many we're going to produce. And next we need to say, okay, we know we're going to produce that many units. So what about all of our costs for producing those units? So we'll have to walk through and say, okay, with the amount we're going to produce, how much our materials do we need for each of our products, how much those cost, the direct labor, and the overhead. So let's start at that. First one, direct materials. So just like everything else, we're going to create an actual budget for direct materials. We're going to say, first, we have our usage. So not dollar value, but well, also dollar value, but this is the amount of all the different types of direct material that we're going to need. Metal or all the raw material, metal, plastic, labels, glue, all that stuff. And we're going to look and say, how much do we need of all that materials are we going to use this year? And importantly, this is in units and cost. So your direct materials budget will show how many pounds of steel we're going to use and how much per pound and in total that steel is going to cost. And then once we figured out how much we're going to use to meet production, we have to figure out how much do we have to purchase. And again, this is in units and dollars. That's what we're going to have to purchase in the upcoming period. And why this is important is because sometimes, like we saw in the last problem, you don't want to end with no direct materials in your ending inventory for future periods. So you're going to have to incorporate any ending inventory that you want to have for direct material, as well as any beginning of period inventory. So the same formula we saw in the last page, but instead of just production, it's for materials. So we get our materials required for production from the usage budget that we did over here. We add in our ending inventory balance, and then we minus out any beginning materials that we had on hand. And so that will get us to the amount of materials that we actually need to purchase. And then obviously we need to incorporate the purchase price per unit to get to the dollar value. So it's a pretty straightforward process. We know from the prior slide that how many we're going to produce. Now we're going to use that same formula for how many units we're going to produce and do the same thing for direct materials. We know how many we're going to produce, so we know how much direct material we need, plus any our ending inventory balances we want to have is the total amount we're going to need minus any inventory that we have at the beginning of the period. So let's go back a couple slides. It's going to be essentially this same formula here, except instead of uh, in total units, it's going to be the direct material units. So pretty straightforward. Once we do direct material, we can move to direct labor. And direct labor is a very important budget. Direct material, if you mess up the budget or you mismanage something, you can always, you see your direct material balances go fluctuating. Maybe you're starting to get low. Well, you order some direct material. Direct labor can be a little more tricky because a lot of times you plan at the beginning of the year and you hire based on that plan. So it's a lot harder to, if you've already hired 10 employees for a division, to somehow scale back. Or maybe you only hired 2 employees and you found out later that you needed 10 employees. So it's a lot harder to hire people quickly, hire skilled workers quickly. But in general, if you have a good budget, it allowed you to plan for hiring and repositioning of employees throughout the year. You do this for every type of employee. So you have your skilled labor, your semi-skilled labor, if you need more accountants, more project managers, all that gets put into this labor budget. And really, it's a function of your budgeted output. So again, you're using that production budget to say, we know that we need to produce 1 million units this year. Okay, how many labor hours do we need to to manage that large production? So it'll be your budgeted output, your standard labor hours per unit of output, and then obviously the wage we're going to pay them. And just like everything else, how direct material was units and dollars, direct labor will be hours and dollars. So we'll budget the actual hours we need, multiply that times some wage rates to get at the dollars we're going to have to budget for. So that's direct labor. Pretty straightforward. In budgeting, it's a pretty straightforward process, but as you'll see, just compiling all the information to something that's usable for all the workers throughout the year is really the tricky part. The calculations, the numbers, those aren't that bad, but putting it in a usable and standard format, that you'll see when we get into these practice problems, that's kind of the tricky part. Factory overhead, it's pretty straightforward. The easiest way to explain this is just to do it kind of through a practice problem that you'll get to in a minute. But we just know that if our products take 2 hours to produce, we know our manufacturing overhead rate. In this instance, the driver is hours. We know that we apply $20 per hour, so per product we'd apply $40. It's kind of the same way we did all our factor overhead, is we're just going to apply it with some given rate. So factor overhead, again, similar that we've always used factor overhead. It's not that hard. Once you've done all the procedures that we've learned in class to create the pools, use regression, the most brilliant analysis ever, use regression to find the cost driver, really all you'll do is apply using that cost driver. So here we have it. We started with our revenues. We've made our production budget. We've used that to create direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead budgets. So now it's time to work through some practice problems. So for these, I highly encourage you to take a really, really solid effort at coming up with these budgets. So for this one, this is the production budget. Come up with the production budget and put it in a format that you think would be usable. And then once you're done, look at the answer key that's posted in the slides and kind of compare and contrast. It'll really help these solidify in your mind. So look through the production budget, use all of this to come up with the materials usage and purchase budgets, including units and dollars. Same thing for direct labor for both products, right? Our regular product and our deluxe product, hours and dollars. And again, try to put this in some format that imagine you were delivering this to the executive of the firm and they wanted to look at this and be able to easily understand it. So when you're working on this problem, maybe use Excel and put it in a format that you think is very usable. And then in the answer key, kind of compare and contrast of how the format looks in the answer key and how yours looks. It'll really help. And the last thing we want to come up with is a finished goods inventory. And this basically just breaks down by product the material costs, the manufacturing costs, and the manufacturing overhead to get kind of at a cost per unit. And then you multiply that cost per unit times the number of units to get to the finished goods inventory balance. So this one, because it's a little tougher to put in a usable format, I figured I would give you the outline for it. So just kind of plug this in and see how you come up with compared to the answer key. So for this, work through these few problems, do the production budget, use that to do the materials budget, the direct labor, and the finished goods inventory balance sheet. And so that once that's finished, we've worked through sales, production, and we've gotten all the way to our costs of manufacturing and our cost of finished goods inventory. So this one's a relatively short lecture, and the next lecture will work on how all of this production budget flows through and helps create budgeted financial statements. See you on the next lecture.